properly celebrate these days. Yom Nicanor. Okay, Yom Nicanor is the 13th of Adar. It was a festival in Israel for roughly, let's say, 1,000 years. It was part of the Maccabean revolt. It was one of the holidays celebrating the victory of the Maccabean. But all those holidays, all those festivals were canceled. The ones listed in Megillat Ta'anit were canceled, with the exception of two, Hanukkah and Yom Nicanor. Those are the two that survived after the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, Yom Nicanor lasted, number of centuries until the Gaonic period, when it was replaced with the fast of Esther. Okay, the fast of Esther is we now observe generally on the 13th of Adar, on Yud Gimel Adar, and Yom Nicanor kind of disappeared. Okay, and but there is an attempt. There's an attempt from below within Am Yisrael to revive Yom Nicanor, but it's complicated because how do you observe it? How do you celebrate it when you have the fast? So on most years, what some people try to do is, because the fast only begins in the morning, we can celebrate Yom Nicanor the night before, right? That's one approach. Yom Nicanor celebrated the night before, so you have like on sundown on Yud Gimel Adar, then you have Yom Nicanor, you go to sleep. In the morning, it's Tani Tester. Okay, it's maybe the best we could do under the current circumstances, except on years like this one, when Yud Gimel Adar falls on Shabbat, right, and the fast is moved up early to Thursday, to the 11th of Adar, which happens to also be the yahrzeit of Yosef Trumpeldor, alav shalom. On such years, we can take that Shabbat, the 13th of Adar, to actually fully celebrate Yom Nicanor. Now, I'm not saying Hallel, or maybe not even Al Nisim in the Tefillot, right? But to observe it, to talk about it, to tell the story, to teach ourselves the story. It's an important story. We barely learn the real story, the full story of the Maccabean revolt, which was a 26-year war. We think of it as like, okay, the Greeks oppressed us, we fought back, we won, dedicated the temple, the end. That's not the end. We're talking about a 26-year guerrilla war with lots of very interesting characters, lots of incredible battles, lots of amazing victories, lots of holidays that were instituted as a result of these victories. But it really took 26 years to gain our independence. And by that time, Matityahu, the father of the revolt, had been long dead, and 4 out of 5 of his sons had been killed. The only surviving son was Shimon, who becomes the leader of Israel once our land is fully free. So if we're going to learn the story of Yom Nicanor, which I think we should, I think that story really begins in the wake of the Maccabean victory, of the Hanukkah story, the actual rededication of the temple, when we take Jerusalem, okay? So now we have Jerusalem. We're kind of sort of governing ourselves. according to the Syrian Greeks, they still rule our land. According to the Maccabean, we're free. There's another major battle that takes place. Remember, Antiochus IV, the emperor, had put Lysias in charge of the Judean campaign. He also made Lysias responsible for his son Antiochus V, who was a child at the time. And Lysias, for the second time, attacks Israel from the south, but this time with elephants. Okay? We engage them around Beit Zachariah, which is now Beit Zachariah, which is now actually Beit Zachariah, Gush Etzion. We see the elephants, and we have never seen elephants before. These are like tanks. These are the tanks of the ancient world. Elazar, the 4th son of Matityahu, thinks that the king is on top of one of these elephants because he sees The decorations on the elephant indicate that there's royalty on top. He runs with a spear, and he stabs the elephant from underneath with the spear. He kills the elephant. The elephant collapses on top of Elazar. So both the elephant is killed and Elazar is killed. Today, the Jewish town of Elazar is actually built there in honor of Elazar ben Matityahu, alav hashalom. So the Maccabees, for the first time, flee. It's the first time we retreat in battle. We flee back to the city of Jerusalem, which we had already conquered in the previous battle, right? In the Battle of Beit Sur, then we conquered Jerusalem, liberate the Temple Mount, and rededicate the temple, the miracle of the oil. So we have Jerusalem. We run back to Jerusalem, and the Syrian Greeks pursue us. Lysias pursues us, lays siege to the temple, to the city of Jerusalem. And this is a problem because it's a Shemitah year, and we're short on food. Okay? Now, Lysias begins to negotiate with us. He basically says, and he has to, by the way, even though we're in a very difficult situation, Antiochus IV had been killed. Philip, who was with Antiochus IV on his campaign in the east, now is coming back to Antioch to claim the throne. But Lysias is responsible for the child king, Antiochus V, who he pretty much controls. So now Lysias wants to fight Philip for the throne. So he has to run back to Antioch, and he can't waste his time laying siege to us. Okay, laying siege to Jerusalem. So he wants to make a deal. The deal is, we'll let you go back to your ways, your folk ways, your culture, your values, your halacha, your Torah. You can live according to your Torah. You can have Shabbat. You can have your calendar back. Remember, the Syrian Greeks had taken away our calendar. Brit Milah, right? Torah. You can live according to the ways of your ancestors. But stop fighting. You have to accept your place as part of the vast Seleucid Greek Empire. Okay? Would you mind closing the door just because of the noise? Thank you. Right. So, well, the Hasidim was a group that made up the bulk of the Maccabean forces.
The Zealots?
No, there are no Zealots yet. The Hasidim later in history, I would argue, become the Pharisees, and the Maccabean become the Zealots. Right? So the Hasidim say, yes, it's a great deal. They've been fighting for years. They've been fighting for Shabbat. They've been fighting for our calendar. They've been fighting for Brit Milah. They've been fighting for Torah. They've been fighting against prima nocta laws. You know, prima nocta laws are where at every Jewish wedding, the bride would have to spend her first night with a Greek officer. Right? These are one of the laws that the Seleucid Greeks imposed on us, and Antiochus IV imposed on us. So the Hasidim were fighting because of all this, led by the Maccabees. What?
How well recorded is all of this?
I don't know, it's well recorded in the first two books of Maccabees and in Josephus.
But we don't take the Maccabees it's apocrypha for us.
It's still our history. What do you mean it's historical record? It's not prophecy. Although I'm going to argue maybe that's not true either. But it's not part of Tanakh.
Why is it?
Why is it not part of Tanakh? Look, we had thousands of prophets walking around this country in the era of Tanakh. The only prophets whose prophecies were recorded and they're canonized in the Tanakh are those who are relevant for us today, right now. Meaning if they're relevant only for then, but not for us right now, they weren't included. Those that were canonized are relevant for all time and have something to teach us about the chapter of history we're living in always. In every chapter of history, these stories are teaching us something about the present. Prophetic, okay? That's why they're included. Prophecies that were relevant only temporary, to their given context are not included in Tanakh. They're still prophecies. Now, in the Second Temple period, there's, we could say, a lack of prophecy. The Maccabean revolt takes place in the Second Temple period. Although one could argue that this prophetic, remember, if we're going to say that the prophetic experience is linked to the pull towards idolatry, right? Our sages in the beginning of the Second Temple period eliminated the pull towards idolatry and prophecy together. Because it was that experience, the experience that humanity was having, not just Israel, but humanity was having an experience. Different civilizations understood these things differently, meaning you had the Greeks who had an explanation for the experience they were having. Their explanation had more to do with Zeus and Aphrodite and Hercules and all this stuff. Like that was how they explained the experience they were having. Israel had a Torah and a different explanation for the experience we were having, right? When this change happened, this change in the human experience, when we transitioned from an age of mythology to an age of philosophy, and suddenly of philosophies and religions and all these things, to explain a world according to our intellectual understanding. Before there was an experiential power that caused people to either become prophets or idolaters. Now we're not experiencing that anymore, and we have an intellectual explanation for the world that manifests as religion, it manifests as philosophy, and you have different cultures at that time, around the time of the destruction of the first temple, beginning of the second temple period, suddenly introducing like Confucius, Taoism, and Greek philosophy. All these things suddenly come into the world, okay? Because humanity needed intellectual explanations to replace the spiritual experience we'd been having until then. The Greeks basically say our ancestors were primitive morons, and they believed in all this mumbo-jumbo about different gods walking the earth. We're smarter than them, and we're going to recreate the world according to our intellect, and then you have the philosophers, okay? The Judeans at this time don't say that. They say our ancestors had a real experience, a real prophetic experience that we're not having, and we're going to try to preserve it intellectually. And one day, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll have it again. And that's, by the way, what the state of Israel is about. And Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, this is a historic process, B'ezrat Hashem, bringing us back to the prophetic experience, bringing humanity back to the prophetic experience, right? That's why it's so important to celebrate these days, right? Because this is something important for human history, yeah.
So when you say that the sages ended prophecy, like, I might be misunderstanding, the sages performed some sort of action?
There's different opinions on what happened.
Oh, really?
There's different opinions on what the sages actually did to end prophecy, to end the pull towards idolatry. The motivation, the intention of the sages was to end our pull towards idolatry. The ending of our prophetic experience was a side effect because they were connected.
I see.
The world we lived in, right? The way we perceive the world impacts our experience of the world. We say all day, Baruch Atah Hashem, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because it's a consciousness building experience. The more I acknowledge out loud to myself that the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, this creator, the author of history, this timeless ultimate reality without end is abundantly present in my life, the more I experience that. And the more I experience it, it impacts my experience of all of life, not just when I'm, eating that banana or drinking that glass of water, a cup of coffee, whatever. Like, the more we remind ourselves that Hashem is abundantly present in our lives, the more we experience Hashem is abundantly present in our lives. It's just the way it works. So the way our calendar and our even our daily rituals are established and set up is really this consciousness building experience, the tefillot, the brachot, everything. But at that time, it says that every blade of grass has an angel telling it to grow. There's like a spiritual force. It's like a back end of creation. There's the code, right? You have the front end of a website and you have the code. So there's the code. There's the back end of creation, the back end of the universe that shines into this world. And we at that time were able to perceive the back end much more than we can today. So we were really experiencing the spiritual power of the blades of grass. And we're experiencing the spiritual power of the tree, and the spiritual power of the sun, and the spiritual power of the birds, and that can lead a person to have a very prophetic experience if they're strong and disciplined and know the guidelines, right, and stay within the halachot of how they're supposed to respond to this spiritual experience. Or they can just become an idolater. And if they're weak, right, they need that spiritual quick fix. They need to sacrifice a goat to some tree but they're feeling something. It's not some stupid thing, some primitive thing that they think they're going to sacrifice a goat to the tree. They're having an experience, a real experience that motivates, just the same as a crackhead has a real experience when he smokes crack, and he needs to smoke crack, right? So that's the way idolatry was, and that's what our sages were trying to fight. But fighting that meant eliminating the spiritual experience, which in turn also cut off the channel to prophecy. Okay. Now, one of the understandings of how this happened, an understanding that I happen to like, but it's not the only understanding, is that our sages introduced Greek philosophy into Judean society. And that changed how we perceive the world and therefore changed how we experience the world. We now had a much more rationalist approach to the world around us, which prevented us from experiencing the spiritual back end of everything around us. There's some things we still relate to that way. For example, a Torah scroll, a mezuzah, a pair of tefillin. We still relate to these objects as holy.
Yeah.
But we don't feel that way about a blade of grass anymore. We don't feel that way about a tree anymore. So our spiritual experience was changed. Now, this, according to the Maharal of Prague, in his Sefer Ner Mitzvah, that's his Sefer on Chanukah, he talks about how Yavan, the Greek influence, where they were talking about Greek military occupation or Greek philosophical occupation, like the spiritual, intellectual domination of Greece over our society, was able to reach to the level of the Heichal, right? But not into the flask of the Kohen. Meaning that the flask of the Kohen Gadol, where we found oil, but not enough oil, right? The pure oil was uncontaminated by Greek influence. And therefore, and again, this is somewhat metaphoric also, because the Maccabim, who are also Kohanim, the sons of Mattatyahu, who are also Kohanim, represent that part of Israel that was molested by the Greek influence. And therefore, it's possible that we could say Mattatyahu and his sons were actually having a prophetic experience. Okay. We're actually experiencing the world in a way that was much more like our ancestors than the rest of Judean society. We could say maybe that they were really experiencing, if they're uncontaminated by the Greek influence, by the Greek spiritual, intellectual influence, then they might be having a prophetic experience like our ancestors in the First Temple period. And then they're able to push back against the Greek domination. That's one way of looking at it. So just to continue the story, the Hasidim, who are the majority of the fighters in the Maccabean army under the command of Yehuda Maccabee, they agree. They say, yes, we want a calendar, we want Shabbat, we want Brit Milah, we want Torah, and we're not going to fight. The Maccabim, however, say no. The Maccabim say, we have a mitzvah to liberate our land from foreign rule, and we're not going to accept Greek rule. We can't accept Greek rule. Therefore, even though the Hasidim accept Lysias' terms for peace, the Maccabim say no. The Maccabim still hold Jerusalem. Lysias still has to go back to Antioch to fight for the throne. The Hasidim go back to their families, their farms, their lives, their wives, their families, right? And that's what happens. On his way out, as a gesture, Lysias takes Menelaus. Menelaus was the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, but he wasn't the Kohen. He was actually from the tribe of Benjamin. He was the Kohen Gadol who was appointed by Antiochus IV as leader of Judea, as tax collector of Judea, right? The Kohen Gadol wasn't just a religious function. He was also the tax collector, the political leader of the Jews. So Lysias, as a gesture to the Maccabim and the Hasidim, take Menelaus, who had been responsible for a lot of the conflict, because there was like an internal cultural conflict between the Hellenists and the more traditional Judeans, and Menelaus really kind of dragged Antiochus and the Greek military into it. So Menelaus is now drowned in a tower of ashes. okay, as a gesture to the Maccabim and the Hasidim, and a new Kohen, Eliakim. He's actually a Kohen. He's actually biologically a Kohen. He's appointed Kohen Gadol. Or maybe that wasn't, actually, that might have been a little later, actually. But either way, Lysias goes back to Antioch, fights for the throne, defeats Philip. Antiochus V is officially king. Lysias is really the power behind the throne. The Hasidim go home. The Maccabim hold Jerusalem. And that's kind of the situation. We had instituted a Chag, actually, on the 28th of Shvat, the day that the siege was lifted and Lysias returned to Antioch. We make a holiday, we make a festival. And then that's kind of it, until Demetrius I escapes from Rome. Demetrius I was the son of an emperor who had been assassinated. His uncle, Antiochus IV, kills the assassin, takes the throne. Demetrius I had been in Rome as a prisoner, a knight, when royalty, back then, to be a prisoner in Rome meant you're basically living a very pampered, luxurious life as like a foreign dignitary, as a foreign diplomat, but you can't leave Rome, right? Because Rome was like kind of becoming dominant over the remnants of Alexander's empires. The Greek Empire was split in three after Alexander's death, and now Rome is kind of eclipsing the power of Greece anyway. But this Greek emperor, or would-be emperor, Demetrius I, is a prisoner in Rome. He escapes, comes back to Antioch, kills Lysias, kills his cousin Antiochus V, who's only a child, and he takes the throne for himself. He sends Bachides to Judea. Bachides wrestles Jerusalem from the Maccabim. The Maccabim have very few troops because the Hasidim were the majority of their troops. And Bachides appoints alchemist Eliakim, who calls himself alchemist. It's his Greek name. He becomes a new Kohen Gadol. He's kind of a compromise candidate. He's like what we would today call maybe a modern Orthodox rabbi. He was living a halachic lifestyle, but he was looking at the world through a Greek lens. Okay? He had a Greek ideological perspective. He's looking at the world through the ideological paradigm of Greece, of the West, but he's a Shomer Mitzvot Jew, Kohen. He's biologically a Kohen. So the Hasidim can accept him. Right? He's the new Kohen Gadol. He's accepted by accepted by the Hasidim, even though he's appointed by the emperor, because he's biologically a Kohen and he's Shomer Mitzvot. He keeps halacha, but he's ideologically with the emperor. He's somebody who believes. He looks at the world through the lens of Western civilization and believes in those values, and sees the Maccabim as dangerous extremists. Okay. The Maccabim do not accept them because they won't accept any Kohen Gadol appointed by the emperor, right? And now begins this conflict between this new emperor Demetrius and the Maccabim. Alchemist convinces. By the way, Alchemist kills a whole lot of Hasidim who he believes are really still loyal to the Maccabim. He convinces the emperor to send Nicanor, this general Nicanor, to Judea to hunt down Yehuda Maccabi and to kill him. Nicanor arrives. He does meet Yehuda, and they actually become friends. Nicanor and Yehuda become friends. They're both great warriors. They have a lot in common. They respect each other. There's a lot of mutual respect. Nicanor even convinces Yehuda to settle down, start a family, stop living as a guerrilla. And from Nicanor's perspective, that's mission accomplished. If he can convince Yehuda Maccabi to leave the mountains, leave the war, marry a woman, have kids, become a normal guy, then he's done his job. His job is to neutralize the Maccabim. Right? He's done his job. Alchemist doesn't agree. From Alchemist's perspective, this is the Kohen Gadol. He believes as long as the Maccabee lives, there's going to be war. He's a troublemaker. We need to neutralize him. We need to kill him. The Emperor Demetrius agrees with Alchemist, right? He says to Nicanor, why aren't you doing your job? Right? Nicanor has a job to do. Why aren't you doing it? I sent you to kill the Maccabee, not to become his friend. So now Yehuda senses that something has changed in the relationship, and Yehuda disappears. Nicanor is angry. Nicanor is furious because the Maccabee, who he is meant, he now wants to kill him, but he can't find him. His job is to kill him, and now his reputation is on the line. His status as a general in the Seleucid Greek army is on the line. He has to obey the emperor. He has to go kill the Maccabee. Maccabee can't be found. He goes to the temple. He threatens the Kohanim in the temple with his right arm, and he threatens to burn down the Beit HaMikdash if they don't turn in Yehuda Maccabee. Okay. So Yehuda organizes his forces. He doesn't have that many troops because the Hasidim aren't really with him. So it's just his hardcore followers, those who believe like him, that, we have an obligation to fight till our land is free, and not just for the right to live according to our culture and our customs. And the night before the Battle of Nicanor, Yehuda has a dream. And we can say that the dream is maybe a form of prophecy. In his dream, Chonio, the last Kohen Gadol, who was not appointed by Antiochus, comes to him in a dream. Chonio might also be his grandfather, by the way. When you talk about Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Yochanan might be Chonio, right? Chonio had been the Kohen Gadol. His brother Yoshua had bought the title from Antiochus IV, from the emperor. He basically convinced the emperor to make him the Kohen Gadol instead of his brother. He was what we can call a moderate Hellenist, like alchemists, right? He's still Shomer Mitzvot. He's actually biologically a Kohen, but he's kind of ideologically with the Greeks, so he's like a Hellenist. And then Menelaus was from Machon Meir, who's a much more radical Hellenizer, who is not necessarily Shomer Mitzvot and is willing to be Kohen Gadol, even though he's from Machon Meir. He actually gives Antiochus a larger bribe, and he's more on board with Antiochus' agenda, so he becomes a Kohen Gadol, and that's how it kind of became what it became. But Chonio was the last one, likely the grandfather of Yehuda Maccabee, Yochanan HaKohen. He comes to Yehuda in a dream and introduces him to Yirmiyahu, the prophet. Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Okay? Yirmiyahu is a very important person here because Yirmiyahu is most likely the source the Hasidim are using for their halachic arguments, right? The Hasidim are basically making the argument, we don't have to fight to free our land. We can live in our land under foreign rule according to our Torah. That's the Hasidim, okay? They're likely using Yirmiyahu as a source because Yirmiyahu was the prophet who actually told the king, Tzidkiyahu, the king of Malchut Yehuda, to accept Babylonian rule over Jerusalem. When Tzidkiyahu wanted to fight to free our land and declare independence, to make sure that we remain independent. So you have a situation where the Babylonians were dominant over Judea, the Judean king wanted to revolt, and the prophet of Hashem is coming and saying, do not revolt, accept Babylonian rule. And he likely became the source that the Hasidim were using in their argument. So Yirmiyahu now comes to Yehuda in the dream, and he hands him a golden sword. Now what's he saying here? Don't let them use me as a source. If a prophet comes and tells us temporarily we have to violate halakha, we listen to the prophet. But if the prophet comes and says, no, that's not the law, tries to change the law of the Torah, we don't listen. Yeah. We have an obligation to liberate our land from foreign rule and to have Hebrew possession over the land of Israel. We're obligated by the Torah to possess the land. In fact, even before we went to Egypt, even before we got the Torah, the ancestors had 2 mitzvot, Brit Milah and possess the land. Right? It's the Brit Avot. Brit Milah, circumcision, and possess the land. The entire book of Dvarim says over and over and over again that we have to possess the land. Right? We have an obligation from the Torah to have political sovereignty over all of Eretz Yisrael. So Yirmiyahu says, don't let them use me as a source. Don't let them use me as a source to dispute this. It was a temporary situation. Hashem said, now in this situation, surrender to the Babylonians. But that doesn't mean always.
Yeah.
So by coming to Yehuda in his dream and handing him a golden sword, Yirmiyahu is saying, I'm with you. I'm on your side. Don't let them use me as a source. Go fight. And the next day, Yehuda, this is the 13th of Adar, Yehuda engages the forces of Nicanor. Yehuda cuts off Nicanor's head and right arm. Okay, now most people think, and maybe it's true, that Yehuda cut off Nicanor's head and cut off his right arm. But one of my sons offered a different explanation, that maybe Yehuda knew the fighting style of the tribe of Gad. Because the fighting style of the tribe of Gad was very unique in that you can identify their victims by the fact that their heads and their right arms were severed from their bodies in one strike. Right? So it could be that Yehuda Maccabee knew the fighting style of the tribe of Gad and therefore cut off Nicanor's head and right arm in one strike.
Wow.
Either way, they win the battle. Nicanor's troops flee. The Maccabees are victorious, and they declared a festival for all time, Yud Gimel Adar Yom Nicanor, the day before Yom Mordechai. We already had Yom Mordechai on the 14th of Adar, and the 15th in walled cities. But Yom Nicanor came on the 13th of Adar, and that was supposed to be a festival for all time. And Yehuda took the head and right arm of Nicanor and hung it on the walls of the temple because Nicanor had raised his arm against the temple and threatened to burn it down. Okay, and that's basically our story. You can see it in the last couple chapters of the second book of Maccabees. You can see the story. I would argue that there does seem to be, a prophetic dream there. So it could be that Nivuah still, or sparks of Nivuah, maybe still existed for the Maccabees themselves. You also see just the miracle of the oil is kind of miraculous and prophetic, meaning the experience that the Maccabees are having appears to be an experience reminiscent of the First Temple period, right? The incredible victories in war, prophetic dreams, oil lasting for 8 days. They're having an experience that most of Judean society was no longer having, right? So they might have still that what we could say, that power of Nivuah, that power of prophecy might have still existed simply within this small group, but was kind of cut off from the rest of the Jewish people at the time. This is the last battle that Yehuda Maccabee wins. His next battle will be against Bachiris, very close to where I live, and unfortunately he'll be killed in that battle. He'll face 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry with only 800 men, and be caught out there in an open battlefield, even though Yehuda Maccabee is actually the creator of guerrilla war, what we now know to be guerrilla warfare. For some reason, he ended up meeting this superior force, immensely superior force, to met 22,000 versus 800 on an open battlefield, and refusing to retreat, and falling there, and giving his life for the people in the land of Israel. That's in the next battle, the Battle of Bachiris. But Yom Nicanor celebrates Yehuda's final victory over the general Nicanor. And I think that because this Shabbat, we have the opportunity to celebrate it, because, Tanit Esther's moved to Yom Chamishi, to the 11th of Adar, and Yud Gimel Adar has no fast connected to it, just Shabbat. I think it makes sense to try to celebrate as best we can Yom Nicanor, and maybe to try to teach ourselves the story, the Megillah, so to speak, of Yom Nicanor, which would be the last couple chapters of the second book of Maccabees.
My concern is Israel already has a big, strong military power. Why they give land to people?
Today?
Yeah.
Why does Israel today give land away?
Yeah.
Because America forces us.
How?
Because even though Israel achieved material liberation in 1948, and even more so in 1967, we're still trying to catch up psychologically. Israel still requires psychological liberation. And as long as we're missing psychological liberation, as long as we're slaves in our own minds, as long as we're still small and weak in our own minds, and we don't heal ourselves from the trauma, the tremendous trauma and colonization we experienced in exile, we're going to let the Americans control us. And we have to put a stop to that. All right. Stop to this.